Is Bitcoin a political failure? That's an interesting question, and that's what we're going to dive into today. First of all, we have to kind of talk about Bitcoin as a political movement and Bitcoin as a technology, and they're kind of intermeshed, but not completely. I would argue that Bitcoin as a technology has been incredibly successful. It's survived a variety of attacks. Its culture and tech teams and its overall adoption continue to be strong. Its decentralized nature seems to be better than any other form of network, from what I can tell in the world. I don't think there's any network as decentralized as Bitcoin's. And the evidence of that I always like to bring up is when China was shutting down all of its Bitcoin miners. I believe at the time it was about 40%, 40 to 60% of the Bitcoin mining network got shut down. And we're talking in a matter of weeks. So give me one other commodity, give me one other product, give me any technology that can suffer that kind of attack and become completely fine afterwards and be stable, transactions were still happening. Even though there might be regulations coming, that doesn't mean Bitcoin as a technology, Bitcoin as a network are going to die. Now, it will have its struggles going forward, especially as adoption continues. But overall, I think as a technology, Bitcoin is a success and will continue to be a success. But let's talk about the politics. So what do I mean by politics? Well, any technology kind of has a political mission behind it. And of course, one principle I want you to understand is even though technology will often have a political principle pushing it, technology by definition is not political. Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrency at large can be used on any side of the political spectrum for good or for bad. And we see that all the time. Just because you like Bitcoin doesn't mean you can't be a Democrat or can't be a Republican. You can be a socialist and love Bitcoin. You can be a libertarian and love Bitcoin. You can be an anarchist. You can be a communist. Even if those philosophies, you may argue, don't align with what Bitcoin was about, it doesn't stop you from using this technology for your specific purpose. The internet is another good example. If we look at the culture of Bitcoin, which is actually where I started before I even really dove deep into the technology, the number one thing that I personally was interested was in the culture. You'll often hear people talk about the Cipher Punks, the Cipher Punk manifesto, and it's kind of cheesy by now. I think a lot of people bring them up, but no one's really researched the multiple individuals who are part of that network. But safe to say that the majority of them were anarchists. But even as far as anarchy goes, they fell on different parts of the spectrum. You can have anarcho-communists, you can have anarcho-nationalists, you can have anarcho-capitalists, right? All essentially believe in some form of acceleration where we divulge into anarchism and then the ideology that they really like gets enforced, which is normally what happens. So if we look at Bitcoin and the ideas behind it from the political side, it mostly, I think, aligned with what we would call libertarianism. Now, when I say libertarianism, what do I mean? I don't mean what your average libertarian voter believes, because your average libertarian voter doesn't necessarily believe in actual libertarian principles. Libertarianism is essentially freedom to do whatever you want and liberty from everything. Anyone who says, libertarianism about small government, libertarianism is really just about being able to do whatever you want fiscally and socially. That's what quite a few of the cypherpunks, and I would even argue probably the majority, believed. And that was their overall mission. They believed that if we could overthrow the central banks, which they viewed as authoritarian, a free currency from government control, specifically nation state control, would give them the ability to enact their political ideologies. And to some extent, this is absolutely true. But as we've seen, Bitcoin, even as a decentralized product, has developed a framework of institutions, companies, investment vehicles around it. Like any technology, it has become regulated by definition of just being used by humans within our current government systems, and it has had political agendas tied to it. You really see the political agenda of Bitcoin, I think, start anywhere from around 2014 to 2017 during the first big bull run of about $1,000 to $20,000. Of course, it experienced, I think, about 3 bull runs before then, 3 hype cycles that were pretty big. But the $20,000 mark was probably the first time that Bitcoin had the most media attention out of those previous years. And you started seeing mass adoption, and you had the ICO boom. And of course, you also had the adoption of the larger top 5, top 10 cryptos, Ethereum being the number 2 and still is number 2, and almost kind of a different political mission than Bitcoin. But where are we today? Has that libertarian idea, that political referendum around Bitcoin as an ethos succeeded? Have we seen people successfully push Bitcoin-style ideas at the state level or at the congressional level? I'm not entirely sure we've been as successful as we should have been. And there's multiple reasons for that. Of course, the industry is still young, although I think the adoption cycle is a little late. And a lot of people say we're still early. I don't think we're early at all. I think we're actually pretty late, depending on what your definition of early and late are. I think we're actually extremely late for a lot of the people that want to escape the fiat dollar system and make generational wealth. I think as we're talking, the barriers to entry to generational wealth with Bitcoin are being built and going up. Walls are currently being built around the technology, especially Bitcoin. But as far as the political mission goes, I think one of the largest reasons Bitcoin has not been successful politically is because the majority of the people in the Bitcoin network and Bitcoin sphere are driven by a politics of resentment. Now, what is that? Politics of resentment is really popular among progressives, but can really be popular amongst anybody. It's simply doing things simply because you don't like something else. So it's not a productive view of society where you're building because you want to build and be productive, but a lot of it's you're building and you want wealth to simply be the guy in power as opposed to changing the power structure. So what does that look like? Well, a lot of Bitcoiners obviously do not like the Federal Reserve. I also don't like the Federal Reserve. And that's a pretty popular sentiment among a lot of people in the world, not just Bitcoiners. And that's also both on left and right. However, a lot of people, when you hear their talking points, they don't necessarily hate the Federal Reserve for what it represents, but they actually hate the Federal Reserve because they are not the Federal Reserve. They're not the ones able to print money. They're not the ones in power. They're not the ones who get to dole out the proceeds of having absolute control over a currency to their buddies and friends. So I think a lot of people dislike the Federal Reserve. But where does politics of resentment playing into this? Well, you can kind of see it actually in the language of a lot of Bitcoiners. Some of that comes in accelerationist language where a lot of Bitcoiners look forward to the day when the fiat dollar system goes to crap and they're finally proven right, while everyone who didn't listen to them is dirt poor. The Bitcoiners are living in their Bitcoin citadels, so to speak, is what they call them. Citadels is like, just imagine a city of safety and prosperity where all the Bitcoiners go and are living in peace and harmony, while the rest of the world is completely destroyed due to the collapse of the dollar system. So they're more looking at it as a bragging right of, I got in before you. If you didn't listen to me, you kind of deserve to be poor. You deserve the misfortunes of not investing in Bitcoin early enough to escape the global tragedy of the collapse of a fiat dollar system. That's politics of resentment, because true adoption means you want everybody to benefit, even those who don't actually like what you're supporting. So when you start to base your political ideologies off of the enjoyment of suffering of others, that's one key step of politics of resentment. The other hard part is sometimes there's a relatability issue between a lot of the people who are early in Bitcoin and the people who are currently there. There's still, I think, a political misunderstanding, because you have to understand, even if a lot of people get the ideas around Bitcoin, because the current economy that we're in is so terrible, if you're working a 9-to-5 job, you're a single mother, a single father, maybe you have 2 to 3 jobs, you can't really bet on what you think the next world reserve currency is going to be. In fact, you might not have a lot of betting power and discretionary income. So it's not necessarily your fault if you're not researching into the benefits of Bitcoin. The hope is, that's why you have these Bitcoin evangelists going around and telling everybody how good of a thing it is, and it is. But that doesn't mean you can resent people for not getting in early enough for that generational wealth, because a lot of people just simply can't afford it. One of my favorite stories of mine personally was I was talking to a very prominent pro Bitcoin person, and they came to me and they said, I'm so pro Bitcoin that I hate banks so much so I didn't even buy my house with a mortgage. I bought it in cash, right? That's how much I hate banks. And I could just sit and think to myself, well, your average person, even if they absolutely hate banks, is not going to be able to buy a house in cash. Definitely talking from an area of privilege. But if you also kind of dive in deeper and you even go into the Lightning Network and how liquidity is going to work in the Lightning Network itself is kind of a replication of our global banking system. And by that, I mean that the Lightning Network rewards the largest liquidity providers. What that means is the more Bitcoin you have, the cheaper you can have your fees on the Lightning Network, the more channels you can open, the larger transactions you can do in total and amount. So the Lightning Network over time is kind of going to operate where you have different Lightning nodes that kind of operate like banks that'll have a large storage of Bitcoin to help run the system. And although it'll be competitive, it is going to have, I wouldn't say total centralization, but almost an oligopoly of power. That is going to help a certain few individuals who are early. So what does this mean? It means that politics of resentment isn't necessarily about actually getting rid of some corrupt institution like the Federal Reserve. More often than not means just replacing it with a new group of people in power. Now, let's say that is Bitcoin. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin is going to all of a sudden lift all these people out of poverty. After I just explained, those who are early in the Bitcoin network and are able to reap those rewards and get the money and stack those sats will obviously benefit the greatest. But what about for the rest of the people who, by definition, literally just don't have the ability to do so? They may be on the Bitcoin standard, but they're still going to be beholden to whatever the new power structure is. So because of that politics of resentment, it leads to a few different types of actions. Those actions, more common than not, happen to be that when certain people reach a certain level, whether that's be income, status, power, they don't necessarily have as much as an incentive to fight the system. Now they're perfectly happy being a part of that system. A good example is this. If you're into Bitcoin and you believe the fiat dollar and everything about it is bad, you might shy away from letting BlackRock invest in your company. BlackRock does a lot of work with the federal government. I would argue is a pillar of the US financial system. So letting BlackRock or Vanguard or any of those, JP Morgan Chase of the world invest in your company because it's publicly traded is antithetical to the political belief of the Bitcoin network. Now, of course, once again, that's why I divide the technology away from the politics, because for the technology, it's fantastic. It means more infrastructure, more money behind more data centers that can do Bitcoin mining, better adoption. If you're just concerned about Bitcoin, its success, and the price going up, you love money coming in from anywhere. But if you are concerned with the political ideology and the purity, then that's not so good. And more often than not, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing people say, well, I'd actually rather partner with the system as it currently is to enrich myself and then just leave it as is. And then further, which is very often common in politics, is once those radicals, so to speak, who were poor but now are rich and have a lot of Bitcoin, and you see that in the first wave of the 2017 people who got wealthy off of Bitcoin, they simply just retrace their steps and kind of change their tune and their message. And instead of being these anarchists who want to be politically involved and do political change, they buy a nice home, they find a nice wife or a husband, they start having a family, and they kind of settle in. And now they're just happy operating on the fiat system because that fiat number of Bitcoin that they have is pretty high. This all translates into the political world because the amount of political change that you want is more often than not directly correlated to the amount of money that you have. The more money that you have, the more you want things to stay the same. Now, of course, that is not always true. And you have very wealthy people who obviously want to change the status quo, and that's why they fund certain politicians to do certain things. But even still, when you have certain large amounts of money, you automatically have a commitment to the way that things are. And that's why peasant revolts over the past millennia are so interesting, because it's the peasants more often than not who currently have no stake in the system because things couldn't get any worse. Those are the ones who drive the true change, at least in the who drive the true change, at least when it comes to mass wide protests and revolts. As more often than not, the people who are outside the system are not able to access the system, who can't be pushed any lower. Those are the ones who become extremely critical political agents when you're looking for radical change. So that's why it's so interesting when you look at the Bitcoin community, because it is an incredibly successful financial product. Because of that, those who are invested in it are getting wealthier and will continue to get wealthier. And even as barriers to entry are created, and although the community may hate those barriers to entry, it's going to make the product's price go up. The more BlackRock can fence off retail and make Bitcoin institutional and keep it out of the hands of the masses, the more it's going to become valuable. The more the price is going to go up, the richer you're going to get if you're an early entrant. And if you're an early entrant, you're not going to want to hate the BlackRocks of the world because they're the one helping the price go up. Now, you would argue politically that these people would then use the money that they get from the newfound price of Bitcoin going up to fund the political activities that they want to see. That hasn't really happened. And for the most part, people have sat on the sidelines and decided that they're actually more comfortable just kind of waiting for the fiat system to die while they, move to Hawaii or move to some mansion out on the West Coast or the Upper East Side and decide that actually things are quite comfortable and there is no need for change. I think that's one of the largest reasons why Bitcoin as a political movement has not been as successful as I think some of the original people would have hoped, because Bitcoin has become a successful financial product. And because at the basis of Bitcoin is a politics of resentment. The only other important aspect that I think has killed Bitcoin at its roots for political involvement is, once again, the original Cipher Punk mentality, which is to not have any interaction with government whatsoever and to not want to organize politically in any form of way. I've had multiple personal experiences with this, and many people who kind of are mixed between Bitcoin and technology and government, like myself, will often encounter people, especially at the grassroots level, who want nothing to do with what we're doing with government. And they state it very plainly, and that's perfectly fine. More often than not, they will say, I want nothing to do with government. I want nothing to do with your organization. I don't want to be involved at all. And I don't even need government because, frankly, Bitcoin is going to do what it's going to do. It's going to be successful. And I don't need to worry about what government's going to do because government can't stop it. There is some truth in that governments can't stop Bitcoin, but they can kill adoption in a variety of ways, and they can hurt the people who hold it. I think that's what we're about to see with some of the terrorist and illicit finance laws that are going to be coming on probably the next year or so down from Congress or different federal agencies. Government is all about risk and reward, and government just needs to make the risk of Bitcoin ownership high enough to where the reward is not worth it. And for a majority of people who have a 9 to 5, those people that I talked about earlier, the risk is never going to be worth it, right? Because they, one, don't have time to risk their livelihoods and their families on a product that could potentially get them persecuted. That's just basic human psychology. But because of that, it prevents organization and it prevents real grassroots movements from forming under the Bitcoin ideology, which is tough, but it is what it is. And that is just one part of working in a technological sphere that comes from that libertarian anarchist philosophy. The third thing to note is that Bitcoin is technology. And if you look at the majority of technologists, especially in Silicon Valley, look at how they vote and what they support. a lot of technologists actually don't have a problem necessarily with the fiat dollar system. And as that money in 2017 and onward has come into the space, not just BlackRock, but I'm talking about just more basic venture capitalist investment, that political vision tends to die down because politics is not very popular with venture capital. Venture capital just wants to see a technological product that will make them money. Once again, Bitcoin is that product. And there's a lot of different, blockchains and cryptocurrencies, whether for a short period of time or not, can generate a lot of venture capital money. But politics is never a part of that pitch. And venture capital wants to stay away from politics. They just simply want profits. Furthermore, a lot of the people running these venture capital funds, if you look at their donation lists, especially if it's out of Silicon Valley, more often than not go to very well established and entrenched candidates. So the last thing that they want is to be funding a political movement. They're perfectly fine with the status quo. And in fact, venture capital can be a way to loop in technologies into the status quo so that it doesn't disrupt things inappropriately. You're currently seeing that and have seen that with OpenAI and its board turnarounds, as well as the whole debacle just last week with Sam Altman. That is not just about the talent of Sam Altman and his decisions, but it's all very political. And once you understand that, you get a new perspective on a lot of things. Now, my opinion is still out on the success of Bitcoin on the political side. And it's a debate that I have with myself all the time because you have to answer certain questions about what is Bitcoin actually? What does it politically mean? What are Bitcoin's actual political goals? And how does that affect me as a citizen, whether of the world, of the United States, or whatever country that you're in? Of course, as an American citizen, it's very different for me what Bitcoin's political visions and goals are, as opposed to if you're living in Argentina, if you're living in Somalia, or if you're living in Thailand. All of those have very different factors in what Bitcoin can do for the productivity of that citizen living there. But all that to say is, I think currently Bitcoin has not been a successful political movement like I think a lot of the original founders and a lot of the original people who got into it had hoped for. And I think that's mainly because of the politics of resentment that is imbued within the community, and which is just a very popular political ideology among those who do not have power. I think it's because of the anarchist mindset of not wanting to work with government in any way, shape, or form and refusing to organize. And then lastly, I think it's because of venture capital money, which has come in and stated that nothing will be political. We are only about profits. The lesson here shouldn't just be held to Bitcoin, but should be held to any technology. The one thing you need to understand is no matter what the reason for a technological innovation, whether it be political or not, technology can and will be used by the free market for anything, whether that be good or bad. It is very possible that Bitcoin could be used in bad ways by government. We haven't explored that yet, but that certainly is a possibility and one that I don't think a lot of people are expecting. So don't attach your ideologies to technology, because at the end of the day, you'll be fooled and you won't be prepared for when the technology that you thought was going to promote freedom could actually turn around and promote authoritarianism.